So this is a account of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's the second video about the transition from the classical to the medieval period. So we're just going to talk basically about the what happened and a bit about the why. Okay, so more or less the story is that after Diocletian and Constantine kind of stabilized things were stable for a while, and they were stable up until the sort of last quarter of the 4th century. Okay, so Constantine and Diocletian are like right at the beginning of the 4th century, so there's 70-ish years of relative calm and success. There's some civil wars and that kind of thing, but nothing is too messed up. Okay, but in 376 things start to go wrong. Okay, so this map shows Adrianople, where it is. It's way over near the Black Sea, not far away from Constantinople. Hopefully you are remembering that Constantinople was founded by Constantine, made his capital, and then it became the capital of the eastern half of the empire, right? So even though Diocletian's sort of division into 4 emperors and 4 different areas of the empire didn't really last, they did kind of keep the idea that you sort of need something in each half. So even when you had a single ruling emperor, right, he can't be everywhere at once. And by 376, there were co-emperors at that point. Valens and Gratian were their names. So Valens was in the east, Gratian was in the west, and in 376, Valens was getting ready to fight the Eastern Empire's main adversary, Persia. But then he had a border problem that emerged up near the Danube River. Okay, so if you look over there, the Danube is labeled, and it was one of those boundaries between the Roman world and the rest of the non-Roman neighbors. Okay, and in this case, on the other side were different Germanic-speaking groups who the Romans called Goths. There was the Tervingi and the Greuthingi were the biggest sort of groups of Goths, right? So they had sort of internal subdivisions, but they had unified themselves kind of into a sort of extended tribe, and they had their own kings. So the Tervingi and Greuthingi were over the border. And by this point, right, all of Rome's neighbors along the border were very familiar with dealing with Rome, right? They'd been subjected to punitive expeditions, so like Roman legions had crossed over the border to punish things that had happened. They themselves had been engaged in trade and in raiding, depending on how things went, right? Sometimes they might have relatives over across the other side of the river type of thing. And so the Tervingi and the Greuthingi were very familiar with the Romans. And what happened in 376 was the whole tribe asked for and got permission to cross the Danube to enter Roman territory, which was very unusual. Okay, so there are, as with any borders, right, the Roman borders, people were always crossing them or wanting to cross them, and Rome tried to control the borders in various ways. And essentially, Roman policy was always, you can't just, take your whole tribe and your warband and just come across and settle down in our territory, right? It doesn't work like that, okay? Not at all. And so that's kind of what the Greuthingi and the Tervingi wanted, understandably. They wanted to keep their kings, their family structure, be more or less independent, and pick some area in Rome to settle down in and farm, right? I guess expropriate the land from whoever was there. That would be kind of their ideal scenario. Now, they knew they probably wouldn't be able to do that, but that was sort of what they wanted. Whereas what Rome kind of wanted to do was to split them all up into individuals and enlist a whole bunch of the men into their army and maybe enslave some of the women ideally, and then just sort of send the rest across the empire as more or less sort of refugees or slaves or something like that. That would be kind of the easiest and best from the Roman point of view. But this was pressing because the Greuthingi and Tervingi were actually wanting to cross the border because they were running away. They were running away from the Huns, who, if you look over onto the map, right, there is the Huns up to the north of the Black Sea. So the Huns, we don't really know exactly where they came from or what the full deal with them is. What we do know about the Huns isn't great in the sense that, they weren't really a very literate culture. They were a nomadic pastoral culture, right? So they rode on horses and they kept animals, mostly horses, but also other things. Those kind of cultures usually don't have a lot of use for writing. So the tales that we have about the Huns come mostly from Romans talking about them. And at this point, in 376, they aren't really even talking about the Huns, right? The Huns are across the border a fair ways away. They're mostly worried about the Goths, who are right on their doorstep. But one of the things that really helps in understanding about what's going on in 376 is that it's the beginning of a kind of almost a domino effect, or maybe a better metaphor is almost like pool or billiards, right? So you know how you start the game of billiards by, you set up all the balls in a nice little triangle, and then you shoot the white ball and it hits them, they all go scattering all around the pool table, right? Well, in this scenario, the white ball that gets things rolling is the Huns, okay? And the white ball doesn't actually do that much of the sort of damage to Rome, right? The Huns end up, running around a little bit later on and getting declared the scourge of God and meeting the Pope and stuff. But the actual destruction of the power of the Western Roman Empire is done mostly by other people who are running away from the Huns. And the first of these groups is the Gruithingi and the Tervingi, who eventually sort of amalgamate themselves into a group called later, not by themselves, but by other people, the Visigoths. Visi meaning Western, right? So these are the Western Goths, right? Which, again, it might sound weird because they're way far over on the eastern end of the empire at this point, but they end up going all the way over into Spain, which is about as far west as you can get in Europe. So that's why they end up being called the Visigoths, right? It's a very much after the fact name. Okay, but at this point there are no Visigoths, or at least nobody calls anybody Visigoths. What there are Goths, and of the Goths there are two big sort of mega tribes, the Tervingi and the Gruithingi, and they want into Rome because the alternative is becoming enslaved or killed or subjugated by the Huns. Okay, and the reason why this is happening, by the way, is because the Huns have a kind of a particular cultural technological package which is very effective at winning wars, especially against cultures like the Gruithingi and the Tervingi. The Gruithingi and the Tervingi are farmers who don't really have much in the way of horses, and so they fight as infantry in big sort of blocks of spearmen holding shields, and maybe their elite warriors have like chainmail hauberks or shirts or that kind of thing, but probably most of them don't have much armor. And the Huns fight riding around on horses with several horses as backup if their first horse gets tired, and wielding big compound bows, which are these very powerful bows that are made of a mixture of materials that you need to be very strong and well trained to use. But if you are so strong and well trained, you can shoot an arrow accurately with enough force to wound or kill someone hundreds of yards, hundreds of meters, right? And so battles between Goths and Huns look like this. The Goths kind of stand there with their shields, and the Huns ride around and shoot them with arrows until the Goths die or run away. Because if the Goths run, they lose because they could just get shot in the back. And if the Goths charge towards the Huns are on the horses and they just ride a little bit further away and keep on shooting. And the Huns, they are pastoral nomads, right? The only thing that they do, sort of for their line of work, is they ride around on horses, watching their flocks to keep them safe from predators like wolves and eagles and other Huns or other pastoral nomads who might want to steal them, right? And what do while they're riding around their horses, kind of being bored? Well, they take their bows and they, practice them, right? They shoot at targets. They try and hunt things. They pick a little clump of grass 100 yards away and see who can shoot it first. They just so they are fantastic mounted warriors, right? It's that they're pastoral nomads like the Huns are some of the sort of greatest natural warriors in history, and the total sort of collapse of resistance to the Huns by the Gruthingi and the Tervingi reflects their utter inability to deal with the sort of Hun military cultural tactic, right? Even later on, right, the Romans have huge amount of trouble dealing with this. They're able to deal with it a little bit more because they have cavalry of their own. They are a bit more trained, and they also have missile troops, and they have kind of like strategic doctrines and commanders that can allow them to sort of like fight back more effectively, right? But the Goths can't really do much. So the Goths are trying to get away. They cross over into Thrace, right? So if you look on the thing, you can see Thrace, and things very quickly go horribly wrong, right? So they cross over, as far as we can understand. Our sources aren't great, but there's a few different that indicate that it was with Valen's permission. But what is portrayed as, sort of like an invitation / permission for them to come across quickly devolves into warfare. And there's two major things that contribute to this. One is that they don't have enough food. The Romans don't provide them with enough food, and they don't have it, so they have to starve or take it from the Romans. The other thing is that a local Roman commander, we understand, invites a bunch of their leaders to a banquet and tries to kill them all. But something goes wrong with the plan, they escape, and they're understandably really upset. And after the fact, we were told that this was the commander's own initiative. Maybe, maybe not. It would be not surprising if Valens agreed to the plan or even suggested it and then sort of disavowed all knowledge of it after the fact. Because this kind of thing, the treacherous banquet, was actually a pretty standard Roman tactic for dealing with, sort of like outside groups that they wanted to, subjugate, deal with, right? They had learned that it's usually a lot easier to subjugate a group if you've killed all their leaders, right? And so it saves Roman lives. It avoids you having to fight a dangerous battle. We'll see how smart it is to try to avoid fighting a dangerous battle in just a little bit, don't worry. And so this was, just sort of something that was in the standard Roman playbook, but this time it didn't work out. So the Gruthingi and the Tervingi rampage around Thrace, getting vengeance for the attack on their leaders and also getting food so they don't starve. They can't threaten Constantinople because there's massive walls, but they burn a bunch of manor houses and steal a bunch of stuff. And then, over the course of the next year, the Roman army shows up because Valens was getting ready to fight the Persians, and then this big problem emerges over in Thrace, and so he has to extricate his army. And it's not easy to do that because if the Persians just see him, building up his army and then leaving, they'll be like, oh, now seems like the appropriate time for us to invade. So he has to negotiate with them, and they kind of know what's going down, so he has to offer some concessions, but hopefully not too much. And then so he makes a deal with them to stave off war, marches west with all of his troops. Well, not all, he has to leave a bunch, right? Otherwise the Persians will just ignore the treaty they just signed and invade anyways, right? But the bulk of his field army he brings back to Thrace, right, via Constantinople, and confronts the Goths. And while he's doing this, he's writing letters to his co-emperor in the west, Gratian, saying, hey, I have a really big problem. Can you come and help me out? Because the Tervingi and the Gruthingi have a lot of people. it's hard to have a firm handle on their numbers because nobody counted it exactly and wrote it down. And what we have is the estimates of some historians who themselves don't have any sort of way of establishing these numbers with certainty. And I mean, whenever you deal with ancient sources, right, the numbers are almost always like massive, wild overestimates because it's cooler to talk about 1,000,000 men who pour across the border, torching everything that they run into, right? But modern historians think that, ballpark what we're talking about probably with the Tervingi and the Gruthingi is something like, combining both of them, 20 to 40,000 warriors. Maybe 30,000 is like a good estimate. And a total population including women, children, older non-combatants, people who are crippled, slaves, all that kind of thing, of something like 100 to 200,000 people, right? So that is not a match for all of Rome, but 20 to 40,000 warriors is comparable to what Valens could put into the field on his own, like to confront them. Okay, so he didn't want to fight an even force because, as much as that might sound sort of chivalric and heroic, it's a terrible, terrible risk because you might lose if it's an even fight, right? Smart generals try not to fight even fights, so that's why he was asking for help from his co-emperor because put their two armies together, they outnumber the enemy about 2 to 1, something like that, right? And that makes it almost a sure thing, right? So that was the plan for Valens to combine his army with Gratian, crush the Gruthingi and Tervingi, and then at that point, right, their army would be crushed, but most of them would still be alive, right? Even when you lose a battle in the ancient world, typically, only a small percentage of the people actually die. Everyone else runs away, and so then, but after the armies of the Tervingi and Gruthingi have been crushed, then you can resettle them, right? They have to do what you want. You can split them up, put them in different places. They're not a threat because that's the problem, right? If the Gruthingi and the Tervingi just settle down in an area by themselves, they can operate as basically an independent country, kind of like inside of your empire. They aren't necessarily going to listen to your bureaucrats and stuff. So you really can't do that. That was the imperial thinking on these topics. So the army, though, that Valens is waiting for doesn't show up and doesn't show up and doesn't show up. And eventually he thinks he catches one of the Gothic groups on their own. I forget whether I think it's the Tervingi that he finds, and he's like, okay, I can take on these guys on their own. And so there's a battle at Adrianople. But it turns out, I mean, we're reconstructing it. We're not totally sure what the thinking was or exactly why Valens ended up not waiting long enough for Gratian. But Valens fought the Goths. The Gruthingi showed up during the battle by surprise, and it was that surprise that broke the Roman lines. And in the defeat, Valens himself was killed, and his army was crushed. So that was what happened. And Gratian, by the way, what had happened was he had been delayed by an incursion across his own borders, which he was able to put down with just his own troops, but that slowed him down by more than a month. And for whatever reason, his sort of letters explaining what was going on were lost or didn't get through. Well, perhaps they were intercepted by the Goths that were rampaging around, or Valens got impatient, or he thought he was just facing some of the enemy, not all of them, so he could take advantage of the situation. But whatever the rationale was, the Eastern Roman field army was crushed, the Roman emperor was killed, and the Goths were sort of left to their own devices. And they kind of almost didn't know what to do in a way, because it's not as if they had the resources to set themselves up as the new Roman emperors. They couldn't even conquer Constantinople. So they just kind of hung out, moved from place to place as they took all of the food, and then as they were sort of running away from and fighting new Roman armies that got raised. So the new Roman emperor was a relative of Gratian. Actually, I'm not sure if he was, but he actually founded a new dynasty. So I think that's wrong. I think Gratian is one of the last of Constantine's children and grandchildren, sort of relatives, and the new emperor Theodosius starts the new dynasty. But Theodosius becomes the new Eastern emperor, and his main job is to deal with the Goths. And he's not totally able to do it. It ends up being a stalemate, more or less. So they get status as Roman allies, and they get their desire, really. They get given some land in Illyria that they can be sort of independent-ish, okay? And by the time that the fighting is over, the distinction between the Tervingi and the Greuthungi is kind of like done, and they're just all sort of under one king, who by the end of it is named Alaric. So there's a king of the Goths named Alaric, who is, has a kind of little tiny mini kingdom inside of Roman territory, because of the military success of this group. Okay, so that's the starting point of this. But the continuation of it is happening before too long, but a few decades from now, over in the West. So this map is a lot more complicated, as you can see, and it represents the sort of second big wave of invasions. Right? And we talked about this a little bit in the previous video, but here you have a whole bunch of arrows that mostly, if you look, right, ignore the green for a second, look at the red and the blue. Okay, so the red you'll see is marked Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, 406 to 411. Right? So if you remember the earlier Visigoth thing, the Battle of Adrianople, 378, right? So we are talking about 28 years later. Okay, so 28 years later, a whole bunch more barbarian tribes cross the border. There's actually a earlier eruption across the border as well, which is defeated, so we don't hear as much about it. It doesn't have any long-term impact because the Romans just beat it in the field. It happens over basically just north of the Adriatic Sea, so sort of on the east side of Switzerland, kind of near where it says 402 Western Capital moved to Ravenna. So a whole bunch of German speakers cross over there and are defeated by a Roman general. But in 406, there's this eruption across the Rhine River into what the Romans called Gaul, and it defeats the local armies, and the Italian armies, so the Western Roman Emperor and his power base in Ravenna, isn't able to substantially interfere. And this is for a few reasons. For one thing, the emperor at the time is not much of an emperor. He is named Honorius. He's the guy whose picture is in the painting at the very beginning of the slideshow, and that is a painting of him looking at his prize chickens. Right? He was a bird fancier, and he had sort of like specially bred chickens that he spent a lot of time on. And we'll tell a story about that in just a second when I get to the sack of Rome soon. But Honorius was not a competent emperor. He did have a competent general named Stilicho. It had been Stilicho that had defeated that earlier invasion. But when this other invasion happened, Stilicho really wasn't able to do much about it. Partly because his forces were weakened from the previous battle. Partly it was his fault, kind of, because he had taken, we think, troops from Gaul down into Italy to repel the earlier invasion, but also because Alaric was there too. Alaric was threatening Rome and Italy, right, throwing his weight around and plotting with people, including plotting with the Eastern Roman Empire, which at this point was not being helpful. And Stilicho sort of couldn't take his army out of Italy because of the threat of Alaric, but then also he couldn't take his army out of Italy because he was deposed and executed in a coup. And so there was this sort of palace coup that people jumped on the opportunity to overthrow Stilicho when things seemed to be going bad for him, and at that point the whole sort of Roman response to things was sort of paralyzed. And what happened subsequently was Alaric marched his Goths. So these are the Goths that had defeated Valens 28 years before and had been settled down in Illyria, and then came over now. While the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi are rampaging around in Gaul, the Visigoths come over and they go into Italy, and they actually sack the city of Rome in 410. And the story about Honorius is that he was in his capital of Ravenna, which is basically impregnable. That was why it became the capital. You couldn't capture it because it was surrounded by swamps, and it was on the coast, so you could resupply it by sea, so it couldn't be besieged. So it's almost impossible to capture. So Honorius is in Ravenna, and one of his aides runs up to him. He says, "Rome is dead!" And Honorius says, "What? No, I was holding her in my hands just an hour ago." And the aide says, "What?" And Honorius says, "What? You mean my chicken, Rome?" And the aide says, no, the city Rome has been destroyed. And Honorius said, "Oh, I was worried for a second there." So that's the story about Honorius. And whether it's true or false, right, it gives the impression that Honorius left on subsequent historians. So Alaric conquered Rome, sacked Rome, and by all accounts it was a very sort of generous and benevolent sack, because he actually, the whole thing that he was trying to do was he was trying to get official status as a Roman ally, and he was offering his help essentially in fighting the Vandals and Alans and Suebes, but in return for titles for himself, like land for his troops, and the Romans were just not interested in granting him that. Maybe they should have, but it was Honorius in charge, so he's not really making the best decisions necessarily. So anyways, Rome was kind of paralyzed. It wasn't able to respond to this. And the success of this invasion here in the long run was really what brought Rome down, okay? Because they didn't stop in Gaul. They continued into Spain, and the Vandals, you can see the pink line, arrow down at the bottom, continued over into Africa. Eventually, this took decades, right? And this was really the death blow, because Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Roman Empire, right? Rome was an agricultural economy. Its taxes were based mostly on agricultural production, and by far the richest agriculturally producing province, and therefore just the richest province and the source of most of Western Rome's tax revenue, was the province of Africa, right? With Carthage as its capital. But by 439, Carthage is conquered by the Vandals, and at that point, Africa is in the hand of the Vandals. The Alans and Suebi are in Spain, and France is partly back in Roman hands, but it's also just been ravaged by decades of fighting. And so Western Rome is kind of just down to Italy, and Italy does not have enough tax to pay for an army that's big enough to reconquer anything or defend anything, right? So there's one big attempt to land a huge army with a huge fleet in Carthage that's mostly funded by and sort of manned by the Eastern Roman Empire, right, to help out the West, but it ends in disaster. The Vandals destroy the fleet using fire ships when there's an unfavorable wind, and that's pretty much it. And so after that, um, the empire is just never in a position to recover, and it's gradually, well, I mean, by that point, it's already mostly in the hands of these different Germanic tribes, but there's no prospect really of ever being able to undo that after that last sort of attempt to retake Africa fails, or at least that's sort of one of the stories about this that I find persuasive. Now there are some other things, right? One of the reasons why it's difficult for the Western Romans to get their act together to reconquer Spain, to reconquer Africa, is that there are just other things that keep on popping up at inopportune times, right? So either succession struggles, like we kind of already discussed, or the Huns do show up, and Attila the Hun is like riding around with a big army, fighting the Romans. So it's a confluence of factors, but I mean in the end it really does come down to these two things, right? Internal limitations, right? The Roman government periodically goes through this periods where it's just totally ineffective. It can't really act because of internal strife and civil war or internal politics or whatever. And when it does act, it's often very slowly, right? It's not able to respond quickly to new threats. And these external stresses are quite strong, right? Like these are multiple armies that are big enough to challenge the Romans in the field, right? At least at one place in one time, right? None of them are enough to take down Rome by themselves, but put enough of them together, right? I mean, 3 big invasions plus the Huns, and it's enough to, gradually wear down and take over the Western Roman Empire. Okay, so that is the story of the fall of the West.